Okay, we have a panel that will run for an hour and a half at maximum, probably. So it's on methodological challenges. So we've got Nate Baum-Snow starting, then Marcel Favchon, then Steve Redding. So they're all going to talk about methodological challenges. They may insert some examples from their own latest paper. I think I can foresee that happening. Anyway, but in the spirit of it being a panel, I'm going to hold questions to the end, and it would be good if people could try and, it would be good if we had a discussion on sort of methodological issues and how to make progress at some point since this is a panel on that.
Okay, so my plan is to try to take 20 minutes and introduce kind of some of the big sort of methodological challenges that we face working on cities in developing countries, and then give some excerpts of a paper of mine about the U.S. that kind of uses some of the ideas that I hope I convince you of. So, this is why we're all here, right? Less developed countries, about half urban, it's going up quickly. We got to understand policies that are going to improve both productivity in cities and reduce costs of cities. I think Matt Turner showed this before. One of the things that I came across in trying to put together a little introduction here was that just even measuring productivity differences sort of in a general way between cities and rural areas in most developing countries is very, very difficult. We end up using lights at night data, satellite data. We don't have very complete census type data that we have for Western countries. For China, there's something, but wherever you look, you see you tend to see these big productivity gaps, wage gaps, GDP per capita gaps between cities and rural areas. And I think one of the sort of things maybe we can push towards, and maybe IGC can push towards, is developing better data sets in developing countries that help us study cities. That has some good spatial indexing and has large samples. Why do we need good spatial indexing and large samples for cities? Because cities are general equilibrium systems, and surveys are useful information, but there's going to be lots of general equilibrium effects running around. So that's going to be one thing that I come back to in a second. So there's lots of policies that we might think about in terms of enhancing productivity, but also reducing costs of cities. Housing and land markets, slums. It seems like land markets don't operate very well in many cities in developing countries. Transport infrastructure, commuting costs are very long. We've seen papers about this today, or transportation infrastructure is not well developed. Sanitation is poor. Public services are poor. There's lots of policies that we'd like to try to evaluate that might improve, reduce these costs of cities, and the sorts of policies that I think we'd want to end up implementing are sort of at the city level rather than at the very small local level, and those are going to be hard to evaluate with small scale surveys. So kind of an overview of methodological challenges. We're going to have think about just estimating program effects. Treatments in one small area of a city are going to influence other areas of the cities, right? And so it's hard to find control groups. And even if we do find control groups, it's going to be difficult to think about scaling up. So there's going to be linkages through housing markets. There's going to be linkages through changes in commuting costs, maybe changes in congestion or changes in infrastructure use, and there's going to be labor market linkages, and all of these things make sort of empirical work difficult. And so sort of one response is to say, okay, well, let's maybe try to compare sort of treatment cities and control cities that got different amounts of treatments. And even doing that, I think, is difficult because we know that a lot of the treatment effects are going to depend on kind of the environment, on the size of the labor market, on various contextual factors. And so I think, the sorts of issues, the sorts of questions we're trying to answer are going to benefit a lot from having theoretical underpinnings that are going to help us think about the mechanisms at play. Using natural variation in the data is also going to maybe play a bigger role than in other areas of development economics where you can kind of focus in on villages or something, right? Because we have these cities which are general equilibrium systems, okay? Theory is going to help us think about nature of heterogeneity of treatment effects, but of course the econometric identification challenges are going to be greater. So maybe people aren't going to believe as much what we say, right? So that's kind of another challenge. So of course one can try to model everything very carefully, which is what Klaus and Esteban just did, and I think that's another fruitful way forward. In the end, for evaluating policy, in the end, we're going to want to have some empirical evidence that comes off of some variation, okay, to evaluate specific policies, I should say. So even RCTs, they're very useful. I think Ed said this morning, but if they're very well identified, that's great. But they're going to be very small groups of treated individuals then, or treated households. Scaling up is going to introduce all these general equilibrium effects, and we're going to need some underlying theory to help us understand how to think about the implications there. Okay, so I think that's my kind of brief overview of methodological challenges in 5 minutes, and I'm going to take 15 minutes because we were kind of asked to say something about our own research as well. Okay,
to illustrate the points.
Okay,
that you just made.
Good. I hope that's useful. So I want to talk about evidence, sort of this phenomenon that it seems like cities and skills have become more complementary over time. In the U.S., and I think it's probably also true in developing countries. In doing that, because I only have 15 minutes, I would kind of want to give a sense of some of the pieces of the methodology I just talked about, and kind of as a way to highlight the fact that I think studying cities is fundamental for studying economic growth and economic development. Okay, this is not so yes, there are all these policy challenges, but local labor markets are fundamental for understanding sort of aggregate changes in countries. Okay, and I use the U.S. as an example. We have good data that we can use, but I think that's gonna the lessons are gonna apply anyway. So kind of the motivating fact here is that we've seen this big increase in the strengthening of the relationship between wage inequality and city size since 1980, and kind of the macro world talks about the increase in inequality, or part of it at least, as being driven by some combination of productivity growth, total factor productivity growth, and capital skill complementarity. Okay, and what I want to argue here is that that's not enough to understand this increasingly strong relationship between city size and wage premiums for educated individuals. But in doing that, we need to have some source of identifying variation. Okay, and we need a little bit of theory to help us use this to understand why local labor markets are so important. Okay, so I'm going to show you some evidence that capital and skilled individuals are complements of production, but on top of that, agglomeration economies have become more biased towards skilled individuals. Okay, so this is just some motivating data here. That over time you see this increasingly strong relationship between city size and the wage premium between skilled and unskilled individuals. And indeed, this is driven by high-skilled people. So, and I think this is true it's certainly true in all data sets in developing countries I've looked at as well, which is like 1. But that, for high-skilled individuals, they're making bigger wage premiums in bigger cities relative to smaller cities than people with less education. Okay, so part of the process of development is sort of urbanization, but also skill upgrading. Okay, so I want to try to think about this through the lens of a production technology that has unskilled labor, capital, and skilled labor, where you have some potential for capital skill complementarity, and some agglomeration economies that could be biased towards any of these three factors. Okay, and I want to take this and think about firm optimization. This is going to be constant return to scale, so it's going to produce some equilibrium conditions. And in particular, one of them is going to allow us to decompose reasons for which the skill premium has changed differently in different local labor markets. Okay, and so you can break it into these four components. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, and then we have a few other estimation equations which come out of this framework. Okay, and I'll come back to those in a second. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use data, microdata, for metropolitan areas on wages, and combine that. Sorry, that's down here. Over time, and combine that with information about capital stocks over time from the Census of Manufacturers. And what you see just running some regressions in this data, I think methodologically, one of the things that one should always start with is just knowing what's in your data. And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of developing countries, right? Because we just don't have data like this you can do that with. So what you see is increases in the skill gaps, in wage gaps for skilled relative to unskilled people that have been more pronounced in bigger cities, and increases in capital intensification that have been more pronounced in bigger cities. Okay, so where's the exogenous variation coming from? I want to use kind of exogenous variation in relative supply of skill that are the things that are on the right-hand side of those equilibrium conditions. Okay, for identification. Okay, and so I want to think about an environment, a Roback model type environment, where we have local amenities that are city-specific and are indexed by country of origin for immigrants coming into the U.S. Okay, and so Matt Noto-Adigdo does something like this in another context, but you can get an equilibrium condition out of this that tells you that the total increase in local labor market J of people of skill group G is going to depend on essentially the increase in the real wage in that location positively, negatively depend on the increase in the real wage in other locations, and positively depend on the kind of concentration of people from, say, a country C in that local labor market, or sending area C if you want to do it in another context. And what this is a summary statistic for here is just to saying, well, certain people that have a high amenity value of a location, there's going to be more of them in that location. And so when you have more people getting sent, arriving from Mexico, they're more likely to, this is an indicator that Mexicans like LA because there are a lot of them there. And so more of them are likely to go there as well. Okay? So this has been used in the labor literature to get local labor supply shocks. And we're using it here as well. Okay, so you get kind of a first stage sort of equation, and it works pretty well for less educated people. So people with low education levels, they predictions based on essentially past immigrant shares from various countries across local labor markets in the U.S. That's a good predictor of how many additional workers of the indicated education level you get later on in those local labor markets, and this is because of sort of this immigrant enclave effect. It doesn't work so well for higher educated people. Okay, so I wrote down some equilibrium conditions there that are a function of relative skill intensities, or changes in relative skill intensities, S over U, and I'm going to instrument with essentially predicted ones based on past immigrant locations. Okay, so the idea is to exploit this variation. The idea is that, hey, there's a peso crisis in Mexico. A lot of people move to the U.S. from Mexico. low-skilled people move to the US and Mexico in the 90s. Where do they move to? They move to LA disproportionately. So LA gets this shock in unskilled workers, and then we're going to see what happens to wages, what happens to capital intensity, et cetera, to understand the mechanisms driving the more rapid increase in wage inequality in larger cities. So I think it's always good to just do things linearly first and see kind of what's in the data and have some interpretation that looks like treatment effects. Okay, and so here what this is saying is, first of all, the first stage is strong. Second of all, when you get a shock to the skilled labor force, a big increase in the skilled labor force in your metro area, more capital is adopted. That's evidence of capital skill complementarity. When you get that same shock, there's kind of demand. You move down the labor demand curve, and so you learn about substitutability of factors, and you learn about the shape of the labor demand curve. But there's this other additional effect that in bigger cities, you get both this increase in inequality and this increase in average wages. Okay, which is kind of like an agglomeration effect. Okay, so those are that's kind of the underlying variation that's driving. That's going to be driving sort of estimating this model structurally, and basically estimating this model structurally just means accounting for the fact that there's heterogeneity in those coefficients. There's heterogeneous treatment effects. Okay, and using the heterogeneity, labeling the heterogeneity in those treatment effects, sort of some parameter values as some parameter values. Okay, so think about comparing two cities of same size. They get different exogenous relative labor supply shocks. That tells us about elasticity of substitution parameters. Think about comparing two cities of different sizes that receive the same exogenous relative labor supply shock. That's going to tell us about changes in the factor bias of agglomeration economies. So this slide, like I don't know, methodologically, I think when doing empirical work, it's always really important to say, okay, what variation is identifying my parameters, and that can be that from a methodological standpoint, I think that's something we all should be doing. Okay, so these are structural estimates. What do these things mean? They just mean that sigma greater than rho just means that there's capital skill complementarity, which is kind of consistent with what others have found in the literature. What's new here is that over time, we see these changes in these factor biases of agglomeration economies, that you cannot rationalize sort of the variation across local labor markets in the data just with capital skill complementarity. So this story that, there's been TFP growth, and so cities are bigger cities are more skilled, have more skilled people in them, and so then what happens is those places adopt more capital, and because of capital skill complementarity, that's raised wages of skilled people more than unskilled people, less skilled people. That's not explaining the data here. You need something else, and so we're labeling that increases in the skill bias of agglomeration economies. What this means is that local labor markets are important for understanding these trends in inequality and kind of as a corollary for understanding sort of aggregate growth. Okay, so I showed you a decomposition before, and now we have parameters, so we can plug into this decomposition. And basically, all this says is that so what we do is we take the skill gap. Each component of the skill gap and regress it on time fixed effects in city size, and log city size. So each of these has an elasticity of a component with respect to city size. And so what you get is basically no role for relative supply shifts. Yes, capital skill complementarity is important, but it interacts in a way with changes in the skill bias of agglomeration economies that kind of nullifies that importance, but there's a direct effect that's very big. So you can't understand the data without kind of without some change in the productivity of skilled relative to unskilled workers that's been different in bigger cities relative to smaller cities. Okay, so I wanted to be brief, and maybe I've tried to roll too much into one thing, but I think in doing empirical work on cities in developing countries is kind of you have the challenge of data, and so we've gotten good at being innovative with data and collecting satellite data and that sort of thing. But I think one way maybe we can push forward is actually generating more sort of real data about households and people that's comprehensive enough to think about general equilibria of cities. Number two is that it's hard to interpret sort of small-scale interventions. You can estimate those treatment effects, but then these general equilibrium effects within cities make the scalability really hard to understand. And sort of in the context of the little example I gave, the paper I gave, you increase. Suppose you have some intervention where you increase the skill level of a bunch of unskilled people. Well, and you make them skilled. Well, that's going to feed back through the labor market into the wages for unskilled people, right? And that's going to cause the existing skilled labor force to get paid less. And so you have all these effects that's maybe going to make them richer, and it's going to mean that they consume more housing, and it's going to raise housing costs for everybody. So you have those sorts of spillover effects that I think mean that we have to be very careful when thinking about implementing urban policies that either on that increase productivity or that reduce costs. Okay, but in order to promote growth, national economic growth, I think we need to handle straight on the problems of cities and handle straight on the fact that production happens at the level of local labor markets.
Great, thank you.